brokers separately are not out of the loop if there are misdeclarations to customs that lead to underpayment of AD/CVD.
And we can date back hundreds of years. Importing has always been a high-risk, high-reward obligation.
Welcome to SimplyTrade, brought to you by Global Training Center. My name is Lalo, and together with my co-host Andy, we have well over 60 years of combined trade, logistics, and supply chain experience. Along the way, we have seen and witnessed different challenges in trade compliance. We decided to put this show together and call on our friends and colleagues in the business to hang out with us and share their knowledge in all things trade. Thank you for spending some time with us. Enjoy the show. Hey Andy, I think in today's show we're getting ready to open a big can of worms. This topic is just gonna probably just trickle on to quite a few more episodes in down the line, but we have lined up a couple of guests that are heavily into anti-dumping and countervailing duties, and so that's what I mean by opening up a can of worms. It's just you don't never know what you're gonna get into.
Mm-hmm. Well, with anti-dumping, ADD, as they would say, anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties, CVD, that is a heavy topic. It doesn't apply to everything, but so the frequency may not be there as far as a lot of commodities, but the risk is astronomical if you do not handle and declare properly commodities that you're importing that have anti-dumping or countervailing cases against them. And as such, with the entries and all. So we're going to get to hear firsthand from an attorney's perspective of how serious this is. And so you need to be looking for this. I think it's going to be something that you'll learn a lot from it. And it just reminds you on how serious this is if you're of an upper management to the compliance arena, what you should be doing.
Yeah, that's correct. And we've lined up both Jen Diaz and David Craven, both of the Diaz law firm. And I mean, if anyone's on social media or anywhere out there looking at posts, you'll see that they're constantly always reminding us of different scenarios or different cases or whatnot that do affect you. Sometimes not even knowing that your product is, and then I believe they'll have some examples that talk about that. But this is going to be, we're going to dig deep into that in this show.
Well, let's get right into it and get into the show. Let me ask this question to y'all. As we're talking about countervailing duties and anti-dumping duty cases, first off, obviously, it's a different entry type. So with brokers that are transmitting it, that, it's going to be an 03 type. But with that, it puts, it may have the right classification, everything together. But as soon as you go into this other entry category, it's like a whole nother ball game, is it not?
8,000%.
Okay.
And customs eyes are on the ball.
So with that, it's easier to identify the commodities that may have cases on it, but that's on the customs side. Where do you find that information from the Department of Commerce, and if your commodities even
That's one of the
in
major
that
problems.
category?
A few points on that. Yeah, and it's a huge issue. A huge issue, because now what you're talking about is looking at a commodity from an HTS standpoint and qualifying the item as to whether or not it is or isn't subject to dumping based upon the HTS alone. And both Commerce and Customs will tell you that's not good enough. It's 100% not good enough. And it's not the expectation for an importer to strictly utilize the HTS to absolve them of any AD/CVD potential liability. It's your job to know every single scope,
so important,
and to know every single description of every scope. And even if your HTS is not identified in the scope, you may still have liability, and it's up to you as the importer to use your burden of reasonable care to figure that out yourself.
Well, let me give you a real example
insane.
of something like that. I import a TV cabinet made of wood from India. my TV cabinet, I want to look extra fancy, so I make the top of my TV cabinet out of quartz slab. Quartz slab is subject to a dumping order out of India. It turns out that quartz slab, even if it's incorporated into a piece of furniture, is subject to the dumping order and carries through. So my TV cabinet, which is not subject to dumping, is suddenly partially subject to dumping because I chose to make it out of quartz slab instead of, say, granite. And that's not something that you would ever even think to look if you were importing TV cabinets. You've got your tariff provision, you've isolated it, you've determined it, you've searched the words TV cabinet in the scope of anti-dumping, and you never would have thought that it would have been dragged in potentially into courts.
Okay, so David, that's a great example that as you're going through that typically compliance-related areas are reactionary. So in other words, a lot of times they don't know that this product is being, designed, manufactured, whatever, until it hits the port, and then it's in a, what moment.
That's a big no. I mean, no compliance program can be reactionary if you're not looking at the product. If sales and purchasing are not in touch with compliance at the beginning, all you're asking for is trouble. So the fact that if a compliance department is reactionary, you're in trouble already. Just hearing those words, I want to strangle somebody within that company, and that's not the way a company needs to be. Unfortunately, whoever's doing the purchasing and ordering has to communicate with compliance, but in a perfect world. In the real world, that doesn't exist, and that's why we're 911 operators for trade at my law firm.
Right.
Because everybody.
To that point, let me ask something. No, let me jump in here. Is that matter of fact? There was some of our other topics that we've had. That the very thing is, in today's world, you can no longer be reactionary. You've got to be proactive, and even to the point where, vetting the vendors. That process has got to include the compliance and a thorough vetting of it. But then also as we go through, let me ask this question, is that as we're talking through these anti-dumping situations in the design and all that, is that what about the liability of the C-suite? Is there liability for them if you start bringing these things in?
You're talking about personal liability?
Yes.
We've got some good stories on that as well. So some really good stories, but
yeah, it's. So I've seen some things where I've seen some things where, people try and use the scare tactic. Well, potentially whatever, but I mean, in real world, and as it's coming through, gaining the support of the upper management and the executive levels is paramount in a compliance arena. But this is one of those things where, as we're looking at it, in particular, you've got, of course, everybody knows the CEO and COO, possibly the CFO, but and then whatever officer that the logistics and the compliance rolls up to. So, but what happens in that scenario there with what you're talking about? It looks like David's example is like the wheels come off on this thing.
Let me start here without disclosing too much, and David will happily chime in and cut me off where I need to be cut off. But the reality is, when you have a corporate entity, whatever formation it is, the idea between the company and the individual owners is the company is supposed to shield and protect the owners from personal liability. That's always the intention. Why have a company if the company is not going to be the company liable versus the individual owners that are liable? Like, that's the reason you have an entity. That's the reason lawyers yell at people to set up companies, to shield the individual from liability. When I see individuals importing, I scream at them consistently. You should never be giving your social security number out. Why? It's idiotic. Create an entity. Have that entity be liable. But in this day and age, what we are seeing on the ground, and we have active cases that look like this now, which is very interesting for us because it's a whole new world with customs, is enforcement of AD/CVD and collection of revenue by customs right now as the revenue collection agency, which is 100% their role for the Department of Commerce. Just like customs collects TTB excise taxes, I have those issues as well. Customs collects AD/CVD revenue on behalf of commerce. And customs number one priority trade initiative is making sure they're collecting the right amount of money, down to the freaking penny. What is the right amount of money that customs should be collecting? And if customs believes that you're cheating them in any way, shape, or form and not giving customs the right amount of money, whether or not that's transshipment, whether or not that's changing countries of origin, whether or not it's whatever the scenario is, we are seeing customs act more aggressively now than ever I've ever seen before. David's been in this game for 40 plus years. I'm only at almost 20, so I'm a baby. But in my almost 20 years of doing this, I have personally never seen personal liability until this year. Personally, that's my experience. David has experienced seeing personal liability before because he was involved in a different case, but in different instances. But I will tell you, in my 20 years, I am now seeing personal liability for AD/CVD wrongdoing, alleged wrongdoing on a personal level versus I would always be able to tell you before this year, have an entity. The entity is what protects you. And I know David has strong opinions on this too.
Your problem isn't just, in fact, it isn't necessarily even primarily your liability for misacting. Because you can be completely innocent and customs can say, you know what, you did everything you could, but your anti-dump, the product you're importing, is subject to a 570% anti-dumping duty, and you only mark your product up 10%. So my customs penalty is only going to be, the most I could assess is 110% of your imported value, but I can collect anti-dumping duties of 500% of your imported value. So this isn't just, am I doing something wrong? It's, even if I'm doing something right, but I turn out that I was misinformed or had it wrong, or Commerce changed their position, I could suddenly have my company subject to these massive duties, and in theory, thanks to some really horrible Court of Appeals decisions, they might try to go after the officers and individuals for duty. And I'll give you an example. I had a case, and I can't disclose the full detail, but they went after the president and owner of the company, and they went after him for a customs penalty, and they went after him for unpaid anti-dumping duties. And they went after him initially for $300,000 in penalties and $3.5 million in unpaid anti-dumping duties. And we convinced Customs that he had not done anything wrong, and Customs eliminated the $300,000 penalty. And they still said, but because you were the owner of the company, we're going to imply the law that we're going through, and you must pay the money anyway as the duty. And his response is, but I didn't do anything wrong. That's right. There's no penalty here, but there's $3 million in duty. And it's hard to get rid of that duty. It's not impossible, but it's hard. And I've got a case going on right now where I have a client that their Customs is going after them for duty that accrued 17 years ago, and the company involved closed as a business 12 years ago, and the Customs is now going after the owners of the old company who have started a new company in a similar but not identical line of business for all that money. And it's un-American.
Wow.
And it shouldn't be happening. And
well,
you can't make it up.
Right. Well,
but I also want to bring up a point that we don't necessarily talk about often, but brokers I'm seeing liability on as well in a separate entity. So you have the importer, and I tell every importer your two most important relationships are your broker and your lawyer. So if you don't have a great customs broker, that's another story. I mean, that needs to be a very important coveted relationship. What we're seeing is Customs is also similarly going after brokers, saying, you broker, you didn't enter this as a type 3. Here's your informed compliance letter, or here's your broker penalty for this. So brokers separately are not out of the loop if there are misdeclarations to Customs that lead to underpayment of AD/CVD. It's both the importer who has the duty of reasonable care and the broker that has the duty to reasonably supervise and control, right?
All right, let's back up for a minute though. As we're talking through, obviously it's some really grave consequences if they come after you for the anti-dumping and potential risk. And I get it with the brokers, because I know the brokers were saying, look, I just used the information from a commodity perspective of what we were provided. And, you know, I've seen these cases like this before, and quite frankly, I think customs and or the government in this realm is like, it's completely unrealistic. It's like, how can you penalize me for something that I didn't even have the information? And it's gone through.
Or wrong information. Andy, wrong information.
Oh, yeah.
We've seen importers that literally get wrong information, let's say from a broker that was doing compliance related work and not even getting paid for it. So that's another story. So that's a huge red flag, and I highly caution brokers to not be external compliance departments for free, because I've seen litigation stem from this where people lose their businesses as a result of that. So doing the research and that work beforehand, even if the importer gets wrong information, if customs is owed whatever amount of money, usually millions, I mean, we're seeing hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars owed, customs is a dog with bone. Right. They're going to go after it.
So to that extent,
and Jen, but
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Andy. I was going to ask about maybe this might work. I was going to ask, okay, so you're talking about all these, and David as well. You're talking about all these, consequences. But what if I'm sitting? I mean, we see this all the time. We have this guy at Etsy. We have this gal on Amazon. They don't have a big corporation behind them. I mean, how? And they're gladly selling all this stuff coming in.
They're under greater risk. They're under greater risk.
Yes.
Well, of course, but right, because they are the CEO. They are the.
But Lalo, they get caught too. They really do. And what happens is we consistently see those small guys come to us that say, I don't have this kind of money. I just don't have it. I'm getting these bills from customs that are gazillions of dollars, and do you think I'm made of money? I don't have it. I didn't make
Let me give you a real life example of how extreme this can be. There was a case a few years ago about a woman in a bar who met somebody who said, will you sign a customs power of attorney for me so that I can make entry in your name? And this person made entry of a bunch of agricultural products that ended up having a notice of redelivery filed, and the person didn't file the notice of redelivery, and customs went after the woman in the bar who signed the piece of paper and got a penalty of $2.5 million against her for basically, they said, well, you should have known better than to sign in a customs power of attorney. And the answer is, she was in a bar. She was probably drunk. With everything we've been able to tell, this woman had no means of support. Someone offered her $200 to do something that was simply signing a piece of paper versus $200 to do something far nastier. And
isn't that insane? Insane. $200 in a piece of paper and you can ruin your life.
The Court of International Trade has some good judges and bad judges. And she got a bad judge, and this judge said no mitigation, and she now has a customs debt attached to her of $2.5 million.
So Lalo, perfect example of your small company. I mean, we have real life examples all the time, unfortunately. We've had a client for the past couple of years with a small business. Broker gave him advice that the product was not subject to anti-dumping. Imports, no anti-dumping. Next thing you know, $500,000 in bills from CBP.
Let me add the big companies.
What do you do?
Customs doesn't go after, if I am a 500-person company, Customs doesn't go after the owners, the CEOs, the CFOs. It leaves them alone. It only goes after the owner or the CFO or the CEO if the company is 10 employees or 8 employees. So the big companies all get walks on the penalties. The company might get a penalty, but no individual is going to get a penalty. If I'm Ford Motors, I am not going to have Henry Ford the whatever, the 23rd, is not going to get a personal penalty, even if he were directly involved. They're just going to leave him alone. But if it's Craven Imports, and it's me and my brother and sister and kids, customs will go after me personally. And so in some ways, it's a bigger problem if you're not a large company. And it's really unfair.
So to that extent, let me ask this, David, though, and I agree that is completely unfair. But to that point is, as we're talking through it, let's get ahead of this ball game, because it's, right now it's like, all right, I'm scared to death to even import anything, and yet there are people needing to do that. It's stimulating trade internationally is just part of our global economy now. So to that extent, hey, I want to import a widget, and what do I need to do here?
Sure. A lot of homework and due diligence. I call that pre-compliance.
Right.
So in advance of importation, the CBP reasonable care checklist has wonderful notes that I wish was required reading for every importer. So if I had my way, I would require every importer to read 211 pages on importing into the United States, and they would have to take a test and that asks about reasonable care and their obligations. They would have to understand that they're signing a power of attorney subject to terms and conditions, and broker liability is $50 a shipment, not much. Right. And they would have to understand that compliance internally is a big deal, and that they have risks and potential penalties on board. So now when it comes to anti-dumping, within the reasonable care checklist, they talk about this as well. Who's your expert? Where are you getting your information from? So my first question to any business, big or small, is who's your expert? Are you using somebody internally? And if you don't have that expert internally, you must have that expert externally. And are you paying for that advice is my first question. Because if you're not paying for it, it doesn't count. That free advice that you're getting is worth as much as you paid for it. If you're not truly paying for advice, is somebody truly putting time, love, effort into the quality of the advice that they're providing to you? And I question that, because a lot of people do provide free advice, but at the end of the day, do they really want to be liable for it? Do they really have? Unfortunately, we see a lot of it, and I think a lot of it's out of the goodness of their heart, and they're trying to be great, trying to be helpful. But when it comes to anti-dumping, you have about 10 different sources you have to look through at the same time in order to figure out if your particular product is subject to the scope.
Yes.
I've talked to CBP about this when we were at their summit last week, and I said, look, you've got a new sexy AD/CVD page. I love the concept of it. I love the thought and the theory of it. But there's a problem. And the problem is you can't just go to ACE, the automated commercial environment, the AD/CVD lookup. That's not good enough. You can't just go to the initiations of investigations. That's not good enough. You can't just go to, you have so many things you have to search at the same time in order to truly understand and vet whether or not your particular product is potentially subject to an existing AD/CVD scope or a potentially existing or initiated AD/CVD or something that's coming on the horizon. I mean, the problem is, it's an area that to me is more confusing than it should be, and it's more difficult than I think it should be, but it's not the same as, for example, reviewing CBP's cross when you're trying to find AD/CVD rulings. The public does not have access to access, which is the DOC, the Department of Commerce website. You don't have access to see the scope rulings, which are very different than binding rulings. Your binding ruling is for your HTS, your valuation, your country of origin, classification, and so on, your FTA applicability. But that doesn't do anything for you for AD/CVD applicability. CBP is not going to opine on that because it's a commerce question, not a CBP question, and that makes it really interesting, because now you have two federal agencies that you're dealing with at the same time that both work drastically differently, and you're expected and obligated to understand how both of them work. So if you want to truly understand if your product is or isn't compliant or isn't subject to an AD/CVD scope ruling, technically you have a process where you could ask Commerce via a scope ruling request. That process used to be, I would say, a little bit more simplified, but you're still party to a litigation. You still have to serve everyone who's part of that particular case. It used to be 45 days, and Commerce would find all sorts of reasons to reject and make you refile, which we've seen as a fabulous trick to get another 45 days, for example, out of you. But now you don't even have that 45-day window. It could be more than that 45 days. So in the customs side, if you want a classification ruling, you know you have your 30 days, and CBP should be issuing your ruling. That's great assurance for a time period. On the commerce side, you may not get your ruling, your scope ruling back within that 45 days that it used to be. It may not be 60 days. It could be longer. So you potentially have to wait. So in my opinion as a whole, and I want David to give some of his thoughts on this because he's been living, eating, and breathing this for so many years. He's my ADCVD guru. You need somebody like a David to say, I've looked at your product, I've looked at the description, I've looked at what I believe your product is and what the intended use is, and I've compared it to my knowledge of the scope rulings of what's going on and what's being initiated. And in my opinion, you don't have anything to worry about, or you really do. These are the scopes we need to look out for. Or your HTS may not be included in this scope, but if you look at the description, what your product is, what your product does, what your product's being used for, it's clearly defined inside of the scope in the description, and it really is subject.
One of the things that is you're hitting on, the Department of Commerce, the way they classify commodities is nowhere close to even being close to result.
Because they don't classify commodities.
It's the weirdest. It's off of descriptions, and it is a convoluted mess. Is that pretty valid?
And
So,
the bigger problem is that Commerce also uses what I call revealed light when it comes to scope. In other words, if we're dealing with a dumping order that's 5 years old, and Commerce says, oh, you know what? This product's subject to scope after 5 years, and everyone thought it wasn't. It isn't subject to scope starting from that date. It's revealed light. We've revealed the true nature of the product, and it goes back to day one. And anything that's unliquidated gets dragged in, even if there was no issue had ever been raised about the product. And it is, Commerce uses what I call revealed light when it comes to scope.
it's so unrealistic.
The other aspect for this, Andy, that I think is really important, and that David and I have both seen, is you may have a case that takes 17 years for that particular entry to liquidate. So we've seen some, I mean, and granted, that's not the generic tone. Typically, liquidation is faster than that. But imagine Customs is coming back to you however many years later when Commerce finally gives liquidation instructions to Customs for that particular entry. You may be talking about something that happened almost 20 years ago.
Right.
5 is completely realistic. I had a case where I challenged Commerce Department on a determination, and I won at the CIT, and it came back, and then the other side appealed to the Court of Appeals to the Federal Circuit. I won. It went back to the CIT. It went back to the CAFC. Went back to the CIT. It went back to Commerce, at which point Commerce said we don't have to do anything because the petitioner decided not to keep the case alive. It took 5 years to litigate, and the case died. But it was 5 years of frustration for the importers, even though ultimately they didn't pay $1, because it was 5 years of uncertainty and litigation costs.
Well,
And they didn't get their attorney's fees
right.
back.
Well, but here's the thing, though, is that in looking at it, I have seen, generally speaking, that when there is, in the past, it's gotten better of most recent in the last few years in speeding up the actual investigation. But even though there's supposed timelines on this, I mean, there was reports of, taking forever for a case to finally have the investigation end and a determination made and whatnot. And as you just said, every one of these, the record retention, you just keep it going. It goes out there forever. Well, companies come and go. In addition to that, is you've closed out your books, and you don't even know how to allocate anything. Should you be allocating something year over year and carrying it over? So all of that to say, let's change gears here a little bit. is that with all this is that there's definitely, this is after the fact, a case gets filed, you're tied up in the courts, to customs, to commerce, which Department of Commerce is not easy to deal with at all. Again, what would you recommend then for somebody to try and say, I've got to show due diligence here, and even that doesn't sound like it gives you anything. But what should they be doing in preparation for importing a commodity?
Let me address this. What I think they have to do is they simply have to carefully know what the risks are. They have to make a cost-benefit analysis. They have to make a decision as to whether they're willing to undertake those risks. And if they're not willing to undertake those risks, they need to rethink their business model. And for example, if I am bringing in a commodity, and there are commodities out there that has a 8% profit margin, I am going to seriously reconsider whether I need to be in that industry as an importer. If, on the other hand, my profit margin, because dumping will do this, there are products out there with 200 or 300% profit margins because the dumping has so raised the U.S. price, then it's a worthwhile risk if you know your risks, you know your factors, you've listened to Jen, you've set up every possible protection you can, including other corporations. You can, and you trust your supplier, you can import with a high degree of certainty that you're going to be okay, and you're going to find a way to get that money and transfer it out of the company to somewhere where it's safe, and you're fine. But if I'm in an industry that has a 3 to 5% profit margin, and I hear this all the time from importers, I can't afford the dumping duties because I resell at a 10% markup, my answer to them is, you're probably in the wrong industry.
A couple of tips. One is, we hear a lot, well, I'm just going to make my supplier send it to me DDP. That's another thought process, is who bears the liability? And then think about that at the beginning. So as a lawyer, what do we always ask? Show me your contract. And then we get, you think I have a contract? I have a purchase order. That's a contract. And a commercial invoice. Good enough. Like, what do you think? I negotiated a contract? I bought this on Alibaba. Mm-hmm. My favorite, right? What's your contract on Alibaba, Amazon, or whatever, right? I mean, talk about us wanting to...
Right.
So all sorts of fun, right? So we hear this every day. So now, obviously, everybody's level of sophistication when you're dealing with your particular suppliers is going to be vastly different. So speaking to the generic everyday, if there's no contract, great. What's your purchase order? What are the terms? Have you thought about your Incoterms? If you don't know what an Incoterm is, get on it. We have awesome Incoterms 2020 guides. We have a Bloomberg Law article on the subject. Happy to share that. But it's a must. You need to know when risk of loss passes to you, when the supplier transfers his risk of loss to you. And if it's something you can negotiate, say, you know what, supplier, I don't want to take any liability. You ship it to me DDP. You'll be the importer supplier.
At a minimum, what I tell clients, at a minimum, you want to have the foreign producer have some skin in the game. And if it's a product that the foreign supplier says, hey, this is not going to be a problem, I'm cooperative and everything else, I look at him and say, great, we'll buy half of it from you delivered, we'll import half of it, and that way we're both on the line for duties, because the only person on the line for duties is not the foreign supplier, it's the importer of record. And the foreign supplier has no liability if they screw up. And so you want the foreign supplier to have dollars in the game, and the foreign supplier may say, but I don't want to be the only one with dollars in the game. Fine. Split it 50-50. I recommend that all the time.
I love it. And the big aspect, Andy and Lalo, to think about is who has the liability here. And you're going back to your importer of record and your reasonable care obligation. So going back to your tips and what an importer has to do, it's, look, everything in life involves risk. Without risk, there's no reward. I don't know anything in life that's risk-free and reward plenty. And if you know it, call me. I'm happy to talk. And yes, I buy lotto tickets. So look, at the end of the day, there's always risk. And commensurate with the risk is usually the reward. But my point always is open your freaking eyes and understand your risk. And if you don't understand what your risk is as an importer, I beg of you to read the reasonable care checklist. It's 10 pages online, and at least understand what you're liable for. And when it comes to anti-dumping, customs specific question, which I'll read from the guidance, is have you taken measures or developed reliable procedures, not just procedures, reliable procedures to check to see if your goods are covered and subject to a Commerce Department AD/CVD investigation, investigation or determination? And if so, have you complied or developed reasonable procedures to ensure compliance with customs reporting requirements upon entry? That's your type 3, Andy, right? So look, you've got to look at investigations, you've got to look at existing scope rulings, and you've got to look at the existing scope determinations, and you have to compare that to what your imported goods are. And if you don't have an expert that's doing it internally, you must have an expert that's doing that externally, because we've seen anything from pencils to candles to furniture to you name the gamut, to pasta, to all sorts of crazy things that are on that list that you would say, no, we don't care about that country. This is a war on China. It's not just a China war, okay? That's number one. It's not just China that's on our AD/CVD order list. There's a list of every country under the sun that's on that list, and products that you may never think of. So it's one of those, yeah, you wouldn't think of that. Like, who thinks of olives? Olives are good. Don't we love them? We don't have beef with olives. But, at the end of the day, crawfish, like crazy things are on these lists at times that you may not think of.
Crawfish out of Vietnam or something?
At the end of the day,
black olives out of Spain, crawfish out of Vietnam.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Would bond companies be a resource for you to help in this? No.
I don't trust a bond company.
No, but they'll happily want more liability. I mean, they want more insurance from you.
I don't trust a bond company as far as I can throw.
Let's talk about this. David, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Cut that out. At the end of the day, the way this works, look, realistically, let's think about it, right? And go back to risk and reward, right? So every surety is going to receive a premium, and they're going to want to protect their own assets, just like everybody else does. Every business has their business and has their potential risk reward, right? And any insurance company is going to be freaked out if they see any potential items that may or may not be subject. But what they do, if you look, and I want every importer to think about this, when you're filling out your bond request, they're going to ask you if your goods are subject to AD/CVD. They're going to ask you about your ownership, and they're going to make your life a little more miserable.
So you got to get ahead of that ball game
person,
before you start going down that road then. Exactly.
But do you really think, Andy, that an insurance company is going to sit down with you and say, hey, let me teach you about anti-dumping, and let me show you, let me help you answer this question. Let me go over the scopes with you and your products so you answer this question correctly. Let's have a lesson on anti-dumping first.
As long as the bond amount is sent by customs and securitized by cash support, the bonding company doesn't give a damn. It's just not something that bonding companies have any financial incentive to care. Quite the contrary, bonding companies like product to be subject to dumping if you're going to pay the duty, because they hold on to these massive cash collateral, and they don't pay interest on it, and they get interest on it. It's great for the bond. Dumping duties are great for the bonding companies because the bonding companies have no risk, and because they make everyone fully collateralize their bonds. The bonding companies have no risk and lots of benefits.
But let's talk about that. That's if the bonding companies realize that it was type 3 pre-entry. I mean, we've seen both sides of the coin there, where bonding companies are also screwed out of their, but 50K, like the usual bond amount, 50K. Granted, there could be millions owed, so they're out 50, but now 50 for how many bond periods? And your bond period is for that year. So then you have bond stacking issues and so on that go on. But I mean, the reality is if a bond company is out any money, you better bet your butt that they're going to aggressively pursue whatever it is they're out. And they're a lot more aggressive in the pursuing of any money that they're out.
And on the same token of that, though, let's say if it goes through and there is an assessment of anti-dumping duties due or CVDs, then the other scenario there is if that's not satisfied, then customs more than likely is going to be suspending your privilege of being able to import. Is that not correct?
So let's talk about how that works first. So the first thing that customs is going to do is they're going to go after your bond. and they're going to see whether or not, that can cover it and can't cover it. So if the IOR ignores CBP bills, then CBP has the right to go after your bond. You don't pay, your surety pays, then you have to pay your surety and work that out separate and apart. Customs doesn't care how you work with your surety or don't work with your surety. But now if you're not paying duties, period, Customs can put you on the sanctions list and basically say anything you import, period, you're going to have to pay your duties up front, or I'm not giving you a CBP release because I don't trust you anymore. So that's what we see more often is you get on the bad guy sanctions list so that your imports must be paid a lot faster than, everybody else.
Right. This is great. I mean, this is great information. I mean, it's things you don't hear out there. I mean, you very bluntly, you both are saying, do you want to get into this or not? Assess the risk.
Well, and that's one of the things I think is that the importing into the U.S. I think that is a resource that definitely I think we need to see if we can provide the link for folks to use that and or order it from Customs if they still print it.
The one point I would make, if we look at it historically, and we can date back hundreds of years, importing has always been a high-risk, high-reward obligation. That's why the coffee shop Lloyd's of London was created. Because literally, if you sent your ship out and it came back once, you broke even. Your ship came back twice, you were a London rich merchant. I mean, the risks and rewards of importing since the 1400s has always been incredibly significant. And we've lost sight of that in our current scenario because we no longer have the significant risk of cargo loss that we used to have. And now we've substituted the risk of government-sanctioned administrative loss for the old risk of my sailing vessel sailing off the edge of the world risk. So it's not a new risk for importers, it's a different risk for importers. And they must simply be aware that this is not a risk-free business.
At all. And it's know who your business partners are, know who your experts are, and know your risks/rewards. And as David said, you really have to evaluate them. And too many people get into importing with their eyes closed because they're so excited about the sale potential on Amazon. And I know this is going to be a bestseller. And at the end of the day, we pray everything's a bestseller. And I hope people sell out and I hope everybody gets rich. But at the end of the day, there's not a lot of love or compassion at all from the government side if there was a lack of compliance at the front. So I will say this.
Yes.
The last thing, Andy, is we have a top 10 tips cheat sheet that I always give a shout out to. So I'll happily share that with Lalo as well to share with any of your viewers who are interested. And I like cheat sheets, I like tips, and I like resources for especially those small businesses who I have a lot of love and compassion for, because I get the idea of being passionate and starting a business. I love it. I'm passionate and I started a business. Great. I can absolutely understand those particular sentiments, but I cannot understand starting a business without a business license, starting a business without registering, starting a business without protecting yourself in any way, shape, or form. This topic, anti-dumping, needs to be thought of in the same realm. This is one of the largest risks that a business will have that will absolutely put you out of business if you don't think about it at the onset of your business. Prior to purchasing a good, your sales/purchasing group cannot not think about anti-dumping. This needs to be at the forefront with all of your other compliance topics. This needs to be the same place as we're marking, valuation, country of origin, HTS, and so wherever you think of whatever I'm going to sell this price to for my final customer, put this on your cheat sheet of, if I don't have this cost, I cannot determine what cost I'm going to sell my product for.
And the purchasing folks that are sourcing the goods cannot just look at it purely at the cost of those goods, the manufacturing cost of the goods. They have to look at it holistically, and that's where, generally speaking, I have seen where the purchasing, sourcing folks are not in sync with the compliance and vice versa. And that is probably right there is one of the most crucial things that a senior executive could bridge that gap and say, you two need to share your goals and your objectives and your bonuses together, because that's where it's going to come into play. Because if one does something and they find a good source, but then the anti-dumping liability there is ridiculous, there you go. So, and I look at the case on light truck tires. Oh my gosh. I mean, that was one where people were getting tires in here, dirt cheap for all these. And, me being in the South, everybody has a truck, right? And next thing you know, there was a lot of businesses that were suffering because they were trying to get these cheap tires in. And now all of a sudden they've got a whole nother situation on their hands. So, all right, listen, we need to wrap this up. I thank you so much. You guys, man, you will forget more than I'm going to get to learn. So this has been fantastic. I greatly appreciate it. We're going to have more because we need to do more shows on this and see if we can't help people, again, get ahead of the ball game and go for that. You guys have both been absolutely fantastic.
Jen, David, what I was going to say is Jen, David, will use links to your documents, to your resources and all that. Everybody's going to have access to that if you have it publicly there. We'll do that. We'll do that. So thank you both. I mean, Andy, this is great.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Well, we're going to have you again. Promise.
All right. Thank you much.
Anytime.
Thank you all.
Take care, guys.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading.